now we can move on to the third part of the panel, which is the effect of political polarization. So, Richa, you've been posted in 5 different countries. In what way do you think the political system of a country influences the outcomes and approaches to feminist social movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, this is a part of our training, and part of our work is to examine the political systems of the countries we're in. For me, the underlying structures and institutions in a country have an undoubted effect on the growth and capacity of social movements. And just to run through a little bit of what we talked about on legal systems, there are multiple different types of government. There's federalism to centrally dominated governments, there's parliamentary versus presidential systems, there's the extent and reach of public goods, such as public schools in the US example, electricity, internet. All of these systemic, structural, sort of baked in features have a huge effect on how quickly social movements can coalesce, and their reach and their ability to enact reform. It affects the robustness of civil society, sort of predating what we would talk about on social media. We talk about civil society, the NGOs, the academics, the regular people who aren't politicians and who aren't necessarily in power, but are an inextricable part of our democracy in pushing the conversation forward, pushing reforms, and holding our leaders to account. So how robust a civil society is really does depend in large part on its underlying political system. For example, and so I'll just give some concrete examples on sort of how a political system can affect the robustness of a civil society versus social movement. Many countries, particularly in Latin America, and I was interested to hear as to actually you talk about this in the Indian context, do have quotas on female political participation. The jury is absolutely out on whether that has created an empowered female-led political movement. The United States doesn't. That would be almost unimaginable in our legal system. And while we have made important strides in female political representation, we're not where we need to be at. So that's a very fervent debate about whether you change your political system in order to empower women political leaders, and whether that actually has the results. In the United States, Title IX, which was not really intended to empower female-led movements, it was primarily in the popular understanding about ensuring women and girls access to sports teams in public schools and universities, has had a huge effect on the creation of women leaders. Women leaders today can cite pre-Title IX and post-Title IX, and I would bet you the vast majority of female leaders today in Congress, in business, in university, in the private sector, played sports in high school and college, and their mothers couldn't play sports because that space was not legally and federally open to them. It did create them and build them as leaders, and that's really had a sea change on sort of the type and capacity of female leadership, because sports are a huge part of American culture, and we had an image of leaders being football players, and if a woman is a soccer player, that opens a space to her as a leader too. I sort of can't overstate how that has shifted society, and sports had nothing to do with empowering women leaders, but that has been the result. I note these examples to emphasize the importance of public policy, participatory democracy, and pressing structural change. Social movements, which often operate outside of the system, are still a dependent and a product of the rules of the game and of the system. And in my conception of a sort of ideal world, we work together to better the system in sort of sometimes an adversarial and sometimes a working together manner in order to push our countries forward. But the political system absolutely is a huge factor in the robustness of civil society.
Right. Thank you so much. Aditi, what ways do you think that politics has had an effect on feminist social movements in India, now that we've looked at a more global scope?
So in India, the political party or the political representation does not matter when it comes to in India, when it comes to female social movements, etc., because it is bad across the board. You can't really pinpoint and say one is the worse than the others, because you see incidents happening everywhere. You see female politicians across the board getting uniquely trolled online for any view that they give, regardless of what view that is. And by uniquely trolled, I mean, the specific female-centric abuses that are hurled at them are really unfortunate. So there isn't, you can't pinpoint which is worse. But I completely agree with Richa when she says that political representation is incredibly important to kind of amplify the voices of marginalized communities and women in these marginalized communities, so that it's brought out into the mainstream, and these issues are brought out in the spotlight, and something is done about it. We do have quotas and reservations in our panchayat level, but the conversation for having it in upper echelons of the political spectrum has just been stalled. You see countries like Rwanda have it in their constitution that, okay, there needs to be 33% women represented in every area, legislative and judiciary. And you see massive improvement in a lot of their gender-based indicators. You see that they've closed almost 90% of their gender gap. The Economic Forum statistics show that they've closed number 9. Rwanda ranks number 9 in having closed its gender gap because of its incredibly high ranking in its political empowerment space, which is traditionally the lowest ranking amongst all countries. Almost like 50% of their cabinet is women. So is the judiciary. So these numbers are incredible, and it really is something to emulate, because there is something known as gender responsive decision making, which is that when women are in these positions of power, um, they can they can provide more insight on a lot of policies that will impact men and women differently, which will lead to a lot of changes in budget allocations and changes in making better use of your budget and your monetary the monetary policies. So it has a trickle down effect on everything. You see historically as well in India, when you see feminist movements during the British Raj as well, a lot of these reforms like sati and good reforms were all done by men. It wasn't organic and done by women. But as we go forth, as we reach independence, as economic liberalization happened, you see a lot of women partaking in making change for themselves, which is important. Because when policies are made for you and power is and there's a power imbalance, and that there is kind of a lack of balance in respect and social respect and social standing when something's provided for you. So creating decisions yourselves, engendering policies that will affect uh, that will affect you and your community is incredibly important, and infusing that gender responsive decision making is critical. And I think we need to kind of get back on the table with I know the like it's going to having reservations and quotas is going to open a whole can of worms and a whole different discussion, but I think I think coming to a consensus of how we can increase um, female representation is incredibly important, and will benefit the country itself economically, financially, which everyone seems to care about. So let's just get back on the table with that.
That was really well put. Thank you so much. Utanshi, your opinions on this?
So I completely agree with the concept. When Aditi said, and it's honestly it's really sad for us to say this, but change in governments do very little for feminist movements in India, because, like she said, it's bad across the board. Like, there's no government that I can look at and possibly be like, your government or your tenure in power really fostered, say, for example, a movement. I can't think of a movement. It's always been something that's citizen led. It's always been citizen versus the state. It's always been me versus you. It's very, very rarely, and I can't even remember. And I probably don't have the most expansive knowledge, but I can't remember the last time a government was like, a government actively fostered and bolstered a particular feminist movement and said, you know what, we are behind you and we are going to support and we are going to really take up this cause. And a big reason for that is also probably the fact that um, and that ties into the whole representation conversation both Richa and Aditi have so beautifully brought up, because when we see women, even something when we see women have opinions, we're so not used to the idea that first we're not used to the idea of women being in leadership positions, then we're not used to the idea of them holding those positions and being good at their jobs, which means having opinions about what needs to be done, which means that when they speak, especially on social media, etc., they are uniquely trolled. And I like the way Aditi put that when she says they're very uniquely trolled, and it's not the same as other conversations that other people are having when we speak about policy decisions, etc. And even when we speak about representation, so much of the conversation today, and I know I'm asking for too much, I'm in terms of, how much of a difference or how much of a gap that needs to be filled. But even when we speak about gender representation, it's important for us to realize we're leaving out the entire queer community out of the whole decision making process from the get go. We're not talking about representation in medicine. We're not talking about representation in lawmaking, in the judiciary, in the police forces, in legislators. We're not, forget having them, inviting them to lead these processes. We're not even willing to listen to them, right? With the whole Transgender Act, the Protection of Persons Act 2019, they asked for suggestions and people earnestly gave these suggestions. And all of these suggestions were completely thrown out of the equation when the act eventually came out, which means that so much of the decision making process impacts a policy, impacts the government's view of how important a person's voice is when they're making decisions on their behalf. Which also, and there's an interesting book I'm reading about the impact of the number of people who you see who get explained. This is something that we've seen all over, right? Like from a very young age we start getting separated, and very refined, very very similar people make it to the top. For example, if a girl doesn't go to a child doesn't go to school as a in her kg, or she drops out of school because of, say for example, menstruation in 8th grade, 9th grade around, then that obviously means that person's never going to be in a leadership position moving forward, and her brother possibly is going to be in that position, which is why the majority of our legislators, the majority of doctors, lawyers, etc., are extremely dominated by people who look alike, who speak the same way, who have the same ideology, which also translates into design making. And it's very interesting because somebody was in that book, they spoke about how when designs are made by a certain set of people, they only address the concerns of the same category of persons. And something like, and it's very interesting because I didn't know this until 2 weeks ago, that something like seat belts in cars are not suitable for female bodied persons, because they were designed by men, because they were designed by people who cannot fathom our needs, who don't have the same experience as us, which means that the lesser inclusive we are, the more unlikely we are and the more badly suited we are to make policy decisions which are suitable for everybody. It's incapable for us, no matter what education I have, I can't speak for the experiences of, say, for example, a trans person in India, because my education doesn't translate into my lived reality. And the more we try to exclude people in leadership positions, the more we are trying to say we know better when we actually don't.
That was a very interesting argument and very well put. Thank you so much. So this moves on to like our last question, our last audience-based poll. And I have launched it, and it is: what role do you think politics plays in India in feminist movements, hindering them or enabling them? We don't have much time, so I'll just ask you to say, all three of you, to say just 1 minute of what you believe. So Richa, would you like to go first?
Oh, that's a tough one. I won't speak to India because I cannot compete with these experts. But I will say that in the US, politics has played an important role in supporting the reform objectives of feminist movements. And but it's not enough. So we got to keep working, and there's a lot more to do. Whether it's from subsidized daycare to ensuring no employment discrimination for females, ensuring employment rights for sort of the low-wage female workers. There's a lot to do, but it has played a really important role. Title IX would be my example of a federal push that changed my life and the life of millions of other female leaders.
Right, thank you so much. That's really well put. Aditi, your opinions?
Um, I won't say it's hindering it. Like, I'll say like it is enabling it more than it is hindering it. I won't be completely pessimistic about it, because we do see more and more female leaders coming forth, being in leadership positions. We are seeing things get better. I'm not going to say that everything is bad. And we, even if it's lip service, we do have a lot of women-centric schemes, a lot of development schemes that are changing things. We have a lot of skill development initiatives that try to create better jobs for women. We have a lot of education schemes that are specific for girls. So I'll say enabling. We have a lot more to do, but it's enabling more than it is hindering, definitely.
Right. On the contrary, the audience seems to think otherwise. 81%, which is a big majority, think that they are hindering them. And Atanshi, what do you think about that?
I mean, I said hindering too, but I completely agree with Aditi in terms of, I mean, relationally, if you're going to relatively compare the two, then I have to say hindering, but at the same time, I have to agree that it is better than what it was. I mean, if you give somebody nothing and then you give them, you just hand a finger out, it's still going to be something. It's not enough, but it is something.
Yeah.
But at the same time, just to quickly highlight how these efforts don't mean much if they're not coming from the right people, if they're not coming from people who need to have a voice in what's happening. For example, even the whole, the 2013 criminal amendment which came up, right? So much of what was said by the expert committee that was set up was not included in the amendment. There's so much knee-jerk reaction to the needs of the people that we fail to understand that there needs to be more nuance in the lawmaking process. There needs to be more nuance in the policies that governments are putting out. And we can't constantly, like the whole 2013 amendment, if you see that, and even the Transgender Persons Act, like these are all examples where the government is working, for people who have, say, for example, years been marginalized, right? And so much is wrong with these laws that we fail to see how much of them is on our side. And just quickly to conclude this conversation and not take too much of your time, it's very interesting because one of the survivors was telling us, when you have a criminal action in India, they tell you it is the state versus the perpetrator. Or, for example, if the perpetrator is X, it becomes the state versus X to say that, we're in your corner to the survivor. And then the survivor looks at me and says, they're constantly telling me we don't agree with what the abuser did, but they're not on my side either. So I don't know whose side they're on. And I think when she said that to me is when for the first time I realized that, nobody's put it that way, but that is the most apt way of describing where the government's at when they're talking about, we're with you or we're here for you.